I remember the fog before I remember the faces. Thick, wet fog clinging to my windshield as I crossed the Columbia River into Washington, the Volkswagen humming like it was whispering secrets to itself. I'd been driving for 3 days, starting from the red deserts near Moab, through Oregon's Green Miles, up toward what people call the Quiet North. I was following a thread of stories I'd found buried in old RV forums, legends that no one seemed to remember posting, and yet every few years the same usernames would appear again, like ghosts returning to finish a sentence. The Pacific Northwest has that reputation. Places where the trees breathe differently, where maps don't quite align, and where you wake up sure you've moved in your sleep. I wasn't chasing anything supernatural. At least, that's what I told myself. I just wanted to see if the stories had roots, real campsites, real coordinates. The first one started outside Astoria, Oregon. It was supposed to be a small rest stop near the coast, but the GPS glitched every time I got close. I kept circling the same patch of highway where an old sign leaned into the fog. Rest area closed, permanent closure 2014. I parked anyway. The rain made it sound like the woods were whispering against the metal of the van. I recorded a short video for my channel, a quiet travel log, nothing spooky, then went to sleep to the sound of water tapping the roof. At 3:11 a.m., I woke up. Not from a dream, not from thunder, but because my Volkswagen was rocking gently as if someone was pushing it from outside. The fog was so dense I couldn't see a foot beyond the window. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it toward the driver's mirror. The beam hit something, pale, shifting, then nothing. I got out, barefoot, my breath visible in the cold air. The sound stopped. The fog felt alive, curling like breath around my ankles. Then I heard it. Music. A faint hum that rose and fell like an old record playing somewhere in the trees. A voice followed, female, slow, detached. "You shouldn't stop here after the detour." I froze. The words weren't close. They came from inside the fog, carried by wind. I called out, half expecting a prank, half hoping for another traveler. No answer. Just the sound of rain and a low electric crackle like static from a broken radio. When I went back inside, my phone screen was lit up. The recording I'd made earlier was gone, just static now, time-stamped at 3:11 a.m., the same minute I'd woken up. By morning, the fog had lifted. The sign that said rest area closed was gone. In its place stood a rusted mile marker reading Route 0. I looked it up later. No such route exists in Oregon. That was the first legend. Locals call it the closed rest stop, a place that only appears on nights when fog rises off the river. I found a forum post once, someone describing the same music, the same rocking vehicle. That post doesn't exist anymore. The cached version redirects to an archive travel blog called Wander Further, which itself vanished last year. But if you listen to the right frequency on a CB radio near Astoria, they say you can still hear the static and that faint female voice repeating, "You shouldn't stop here after the detour." After that night, I started noticing a pattern in the maps. Every time I checked my paper atlas, a faint pencil line curved through areas that shouldn't connect. Coastal Oregon, the Cascade Range, into the Olympic Peninsula. No label, just a small drawn circle with a hand-inked phrase beside it, "The Quiet Route." I told myself it must have been from a previous owner of the atlas. But in the next town over, a diner in Raymond, Washington, I met a man who changed that thought completely. He was sitting at the counter with an old Nikon film camera, talking to the waitress about the Echo lights out by Lake Quinault. I asked what he meant. He smiled, teeth coffee-stained, and said, "You follow the lights. You forget who you came with. Happens to RV folks all the time." Then he asked me, dead serious, "You seen the circle on your map yet?" When I told him I had, his face went still. He slid me a photo, grainy, black and white, taken in the fog. It showed a Volkswagen parked by a lake, its headlights cutting through mist. In the reflection on the water was another set of lights behind it, identical but inverted like two vans facing each other. "That's from '98, he said. "Guy who took it never came back." He wouldn't give me his name, just said, "If you hear the echo, don't answer it. It sounds like your own voice, but it isn't. I left that diner before sunset. Lake Quinault was 40 miles away. I told myself I wasn't going there. I was just heading north toward Forks, maybe stopping for gas. But when I checked the odometer that evening, it read exactly 40 miles. The road to the lake narrowed under trees that looked older than time, branches interlocking above the van like ribs closing around a heart. I parked by the water's edge. The lake was so still it reflected the sky perfectly. No wind, no movement. I turned off the engine, stepped out, and stood in silence. That's when I heard it again, a hum, almost like breathing. Then, faintly, my own voice whispering my name from across the lake. At first, I thought it was an echo bouncing off the hills, but it didn't sync with my breathing. It was slower, deliberate. The sound moved closer, not louder, just nearer. I backed up, fumbling for the door handle, but the van's reflection rippled. There were two of them now, two Volkswagens, two reflections of me. The second version's lights flicked on, even though mine were off. The hum deepened into static. The air smelled like ozone and rust. Then, like before, I heard the same phrase, different voice, this time a man's. You shouldn't stop here after the detour. When I blinked, the lake was empty again. No reflections, no echo, just the slow creak of branches shifting above me. I drove until dawn, didn't stop until I reached a small RV park outside Forks. The owner, an older woman with windburned cheeks, handed me a brochure for local attractions. When I looked down, a phrase had been handwritten across the top. The quiet route runs in circles. Don't follow your own map. That was the second legend. They call it the Echo at Quinault. And as I sat there that morning, rain dripping from the awning, I realized something else. The smell. That same faint scent of ozone and rust drifting through the park, just like at the lake. And from the office radio, buried under the static of a weather report, a familiar voice hummed something faintly melodic, an old record playing again, just beneath the noise. I didn't plan to stay another night, but the weather pinned me there. The rain came in sheets, silver curtains falling so thick I couldn't see the tree line. Forks always felt like the edge of the world anyway, too wet, too quiet, too close to something ancient. The RV park owner, her name was May, brought me a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. She didn't ask where I was headed, just said, "You passed Quinault, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. She sighed, looking out at the mist rising from the puddled gravel. "The echoes follow water," she said. "They always have, same smell every time, iron in the air before a storm. We used to think it was lightning. Then people started not coming back." That word, we. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she just turned away and said, "Stay off Highway 112 after dark. You'll see signs that don't belong there." She was right. By late afternoon, the rain eased into drizzle. I packed up and headed west, the Volkswagen rattling as I crossed narrow bridges over swollen creeks. The forest pressed close to the road, the light between the trees dimming to a sickly green. A few miles past Clallam Bay, I saw it, an old wooden sign half swallowed by moss. Rialto Station, open 24 hours. But Rialto Station doesn't exist. I checked my GPS, no listing, no dot, no structure ahead. Still, curiosity pulled me off the main road. The dirt path twisted through cedar and alder, opening onto a clearing where a small gas station stood, every window glowing faintly yellow. Inside, it smelled like old fuel and rain-soaked paper, shelves of faded snacks, magazines from the 80s. A radio behind the counter hissed with static. I called out, but no one answered. Then, faintly through the crackle, I heard that hum again, the same warped melody I'd heard at Quinault. The pump outside clicked once, like someone had just hung it up. When I turned back to the counter, there was a man standing there. Thin, pale, gray hair slicked back. He didn't look surprised to see me, just tired. "Long way from the interstate," he said. "Yeah, GPS said there was nothing here." He gave a small smile. "That's how we like it." I tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. "Do you get a lot of travelers?" "Not lately." He reached under the counter, pulled out a folded paper map, and slid it toward me. "Take this. It shows the real roads. The map looked hand-drawn, rivers, coastlines, mountain passes, but the ink was faintly smeared, like it had been wet once and dried again. Near the top, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "The Quiet Route." When I looked up, the man was gone. No footsteps, no sound of a door. The air felt heavy, static building in my ears. The radio behind the counter whispered, low and distant, "Don't follow your own map." I left the map where it was and ran outside. The rain had stopped, but the road was gone. The Volkswagen sat alone in a clearing surrounded by trees. The dirt path I'd driven in on was nowhere, just thick undergrowth. I drove in circles for what felt like hours, but every route led back to the same place, the station, glowing faintly through the trees. I stopped, stepped out, and listened. Nothing. Then I heard an engine, mine, but distant, like it was driving away. I spun around. The Volkswagen's headlights blinked from the woods, 100 feet away. My van was still right in front of me, keys in the ignition. But something identical moved through the trees, its taillights fading down a path I couldn't see. For a second, I thought I saw someone inside, me, hands tight on the wheel, eyes locked forward. The static swelled again, so loud it vibrated in my skull. I stumbled back inside my van, slammed the door, and turned the ignition. The headlights cut through darkness that seemed too thick for night. I drove blind, branches scraping the roof, until the tires hit pavement again. When I looked in the rearview mirror, there was no sign of the station, just endless black trees. That was the third legend, the van that drives itself. By the time I reached Port Angeles, the rain had turned to mist again. I parked near the marina, engine ticking in the cool air. I wanted to believe it was all exhaustion, that I'd just drifted into some backroad confusion. But the smell lingered. Ozone and rust. It clung to the vents. I opened my laptop to check the footage from my dash cam. The files were there, but when I clicked play, each one glitched to black after a few seconds. Then a frame would flicker. Always the same image, the reflection of my van in the water with someone standing beside it, motionless, just beyond the edge of light. I tried uploading it, but my connection died mid-transfer. When I rebooted, the files were gone. Folder empty. I found myself whispering out loud, "You shouldn't stop here after the detour." The phrase felt wrong in my mouth, like it didn't belong to me anymore. The final legend came from a hiker I met the next day at Salt Creek Recreation Area. A woman with a beat-up RV and a weathered trail map taped to her window. She said she'd been hearing the same story for years, though people gave it different names. The road that loops back, the mile that erases you. Her hands shook when she pointed at her map. You ever notice how certain roads don't match the paper? Like they twist a little more each time you look? I nodded. That's the quiet route, she said softly. It doesn't show up until you've already driven it. I laughed then, a hollow sound that even I didn't believe. You really think there's one road that connects all these places? She smiled sadly. Not a road, a direction. Once you take it, you don't come back the same. That night, I camped by the shore. The fog rolled in around midnight, thick as breath. From inside the van, I could see the glow of another vehicle's lights through the mist. White, steady, unmoving. I thought maybe it was hers. I stepped outside, barefoot again, the gravel cold under my feet. But the lights were coming from the water, not the shore. As I watched, the beams flickered and stretched, bending into a curve like headlights reflected on a wet road that didn't exist. Then just before the fog swallowed them, I saw it again. A faint circle etched into the wet sand near the waterline, glowing softly under the mist. The quiet route's mark. I turned to go back inside, and froze. The Volkswagen's engine was idling. I hadn't left the keys in it. Through the windshield, I could see a shape in the driver's seat. My shape. Motionless. Eyes open. The radio came to life, a voice whispering through static. You shouldn't stop here after the detour. And beneath it, almost hidden, another voice, a woman's humming that same tune from Astoria, just loud enough to make the air tremble. I don't remember running. I just remember the sound of my own breathing and the way the fog moved like water trying to hold me in place. When dawn broke, the van was empty. The sand was smooth. The circle had vanished. I left the coast that morning and drove inland until the trees thinned and the sky turned pale and cloudless. Somewhere along the way, I realized the smell was gone. The static had stopped. But sometimes when I park for the night and the wind picks up, I swear I can still hear the faint hum of that old record under the noise, like the Pacific itself breathing through my speakers. And on the paper atlas, the pencil line still curves northward, through forests and fog, looping endlessly, connecting every place I've been. There's no start, no end, just a quiet route that runs in circles. I always thought the hum of the engine and the rattle of the old Volkswagen camper van were comforting, a kind of lullaby for anyone willing to follow the long, winding roads through the forests of the Pacific Northwest. That evening, the sun had fallen like molten gold behind the evergreens, painting the clouds in streaks of blood orange and violet. I was parked on a side trail I'd never seen before, a forgotten dirt road that split off from the main campground. It wasn't on any map, and the locals I'd asked in the nearby town gave me wary, clipped answers when I mentioned it. Something about it had always called to me, that quiet, stubborn insistence of a place the world had nearly forgotten. I stepped out of the van, the familiar hiss of the door a sharp contrast against the deep, almost reverent silence of the forest. The air smelled like wet pine and cold smoke, the faint trace of some old campfire lingering from a night I couldn't remember. My friend Rachel was with me. She'd driven 2 hours just to join me for a weekend away from cell service and the constant hum of obligation. She was 28, fiery, impatient with hesitation, but she had a respect for nature that matched mine. When we set off on foot toward the small clearing the locals had vaguely described, I noticed the temperature had dropped suddenly. My breath came out in sharp, uneven puffs, and I realized I'd shivered before I even understood why. It started innocuously enough. We walked, laughing softly, kicking at the brittle autumn leaves, trying to make light of the unfamiliar terrain. But then I noticed the first odd thing. The trail didn't curve naturally. The trees didn't grow like they should. Something about their angles was off, twisted subtly, as if the forest itself was leaning toward us. The sound followed next, soft, deliberate snaps of twigs, rhythmic but too precise to be a deer or raccoon. Rachel insisted it was her imagination, and I tried to convince myself the same. But even as we laughed, I felt the quiet pressure of the forest watching us. The clearing finally appeared as we broke through a narrow corridor of trees. A few abandoned RVs sat like hulking metal carcasses, their windows shattered, interiors dark and hollow. The smell was the first thing that hit me. Rot, damp fabric, something almost metallic, sharp against the back of my throat. I could see the outlines of furniture, overturned, as though whoever had been here left in a hurry, or had been forced to. Rachel went closer to inspect one of the vans, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. I stayed back, listening. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper of a voice, just beyond the tree line. "Hello?" Rachel called, laughing nervously. "Is someone there?" Nothing answered, and the forest swallowed her words instantly. But I could still hear it, a quiet, hissing sound, almost like wind through broken glass, but with a rhythm that mimicked speech. I froze. Rachel, oblivious, tapped on the side of the RV, and the noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I found my legs rooted to the earth, heart hammering. We set up camp anyway, the van's familiar creaks and groans under the weight of its old bones supposed to be comforting, but they weren't. I kept glancing toward the trees, expecting movement that never came. That night, I woke at an ungodly hour, the mist curling through the clearing like fingers, wet and cold against my skin. The whispering was back, closer, circling the van. I couldn't tell if it was inside my head or outside, a dissonance that made the air itself feel alive. Rachel slept beside me, oblivious, snoring softly, the rhythm of her breath grounding me. I thought about leaving, but curiosity, stubborn, perilous, kept me in place. I slipped out of the van, flashlight in hand, and stepped into the fog. Each step felt heavier than the last, the earth beneath my feet damp, as though it wanted to pull me in. I followed the sound, tracing it around the edge of the clearing to a row of RVs that leaned together like conspirators sharing secrets. One of them had a door slightly ajar, a shadow flickering inside. I hesitated, and then it moved. I can't explain what I saw, only that it wasn't human. A shape, wrong in angle, wrong in size, shifting between the broken frames of the van. I wanted to scream, but the air pressed against my throat, a silent hand stopping the sound. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots that seemed to grow out of nowhere. Rachel woke, her voice panicked, calling my name. But when I tried to respond, it came out as a strangled gasp. By the time she had grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the van, the shape was gone. But the whispering remained, circling, hissing, promising that we weren't alone. We spent the night locked inside, hearts hammering, the van trembling with the rhythm of our fear. Morning came reluctantly, pale light spilling over the horizon, but the clearing had changed. The RVs looked older, rusted further than they had the night before. Windows darkened. Even the path we had followed seemed unfamiliar. The trees angled differently, shadows longer than reason should allow. Rachel said nothing, but her hands shook as she made coffee, the aroma doing little to mask the metallic tang of fear still in the air. It wasn't until we decided to leave that I realized our mistake. The trail that should have led us back to the main road vanished. Every turn we took led us deeper into the forest, looping back to the clearing, as if the woods themselves had swallowed the path whole. Panic rose, slow and suffocating. I tried to reason, to calm myself, but the whispering had returned, faint but unmistakable. A chorus of voices speaking in tones that were almost English, almost human, teasing at the edge of comprehension. I remembered a story a local had told me once about travelers who vanished on trails that weren't on the map. He had described it casually, over coffee, eyes distant, but now I understood. They didn't just disappear. They became part of the forest, absorbed into the silence, the shadows, the whispers that no one outside could hear. And I felt, chillingly, that if we didn't find our way out soon, we would too. Rachel was the first to break down. Her voice trembled as she begged for directions, for a sign, anything to indicate a path out. I tried to comfort her, but the forest laughed in response. It pressed closer, leaves brushing like fingers against my neck, roots clutching at my boots. Then I saw it again, a glimpse through the mist. A figure, thin, elongated, moving with impossible grace between the RVs. It paused, turning toward us, and I felt its gaze settle on me, cold and assessing. I ran. We ran blindly, branches whipping against our faces, fog so thick we could barely see our hands in front of our eyes. The whispering became a chorus, voices overlapping, rising, a crescendo that made my ears ache and my mind reel. I felt my heart in my throat, lungs burning, legs straining. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The clearing was gone, replaced by a simple dirt path, one I recognized from our drive-in. The forest seemed normal. Morning sun filtering through the trees, birds calling, the occasional rustle of a squirrel. We didn't speak as we walked the path back to the main campground. Neither of us trusted our voices after what we had heard, what we had seen. The locals asked where we had camped, and we said nothing. We left early the next morning, the van rumbling steadily down the highway, each mile taking us further from the forest that had almost claimed us. I never returned to that clearing, and yet I still think of it. The whispering haunts my memory, the unnatural angles of the trees, the cold calculation in those shadowed forms. But more than fear, it taught me something essential. That some places are alive in ways we cannot understand, and that respect, caution, and attentiveness are more than virtues in the wild. They are survival. Camping in a Volkswagen van has always been about freedom, the wind in your hair, the intimacy of sleeping under the stars, the thrill of exploring unknown roads. But sometimes it is also about listening to the whispers, the subtle shifts in the forest, the faint warning signs that our rational minds dismiss until it is almost too late. I think of the van often, Parked beside the misty lake, early morning fog curling across the water, the smell of wet earth and pine filling the cabin. I think of Rachel, her hand in mine, eyes wide, and the silent understanding that passed between us without words. The forest can take, yes, but it can also teach. And if you are brave, or perhaps foolish enough to wander its trails, you will learn that lesson in ways you never imagined. Because the roads we choose to travel in our Volkswagens are never just paths through the woods, they are journeys into the unknown, where fear and awe coexist, and where every rustle, every whisper, and every shadow is a reminder that life is fragile, precious, and full of stories we can scarcely comprehend. Even days later, the memory of that clearing clung to me like mist on the windows of the van. I tried to return to normal life. The office, the hum of traffic, the chatter of people who hadn't seen or felt the forest breathe, but everything felt muted. Rachel and I stayed in touch, our calls brief and hesitant, because neither of us wanted to articulate the full weight of what we'd experienced. Words seemed insufficient. Weeks passed before I felt the itch to drive again, to wander the roads in search of something. Answers, perhaps, or maybe just the familiar comfort of my Volkswagen's engine humming beneath me. The memory of the whispering never faded. It had become a constant companion in the quiet moments, in the pauses between the demands of life. I knew the forest was alive in a way that no map or guidebook could explain, and that knowledge both terrified and exhilarated me. One weekend, driven by curiosity I could no longer resist, I took a route deeper into the Cascades, farther than I'd gone before. The sun was low when I spotted a small campground tucked into a valley, a few rusted metal signs announcing its presence. There were no other campers, just the faint echo of distant voices carried by the wind, or so I told myself. The smell of damp earth and moss was immediate, rich, and unmistakably familiar. My pulse quickened. Even alone, I felt the weight of the forest's attention. I parked near the edge of the campsite, where a small clearing opened to a cluster of old Volkswagen vans, each one abandoned, their paint chipped and faded by years of sun and rain. The sight struck a strange chord in me. This was not the first time I had seen these empty hulks, and yet I felt that I had stepped into another layer of the same forest I had fled weeks before. Every instinct screamed that I should leave, but I could not. Some part of me, call it curiosity, call it stubbornness, demanded that I explore. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was not the kind of peaceful quiet that blankets a campsite at dawn. This silence was oppressive, thick and unyielding. No birds sang, no wind rustled the trees. Even the leaves on the ground seemed unnaturally still. I stepped out of the van, boots crunching softly on the damp soil, and approached one of the abandoned vehicles. The windows were streaked with grime, but through the murky glass, I could see the outlines of furniture overturned, personal items scattered, as though someone had left in a hurry, or had been made to leave. A sudden noise shattered the silence. A faint scraping, like fingernails across metal, came from the van next to mine. My heart pounded. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself it was a branch. I told myself anything but what I feared, that I was not alone. The sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic. It was closer now, and I could feel its presence behind me in the shadows of the trees. I spun, flashlight in hand, and saw nothing. Only the forest, breathing slowly, dark and patient. But I felt it, that unshakable sensation that I was being observed, studied, measured. I called out softly, my voice trembling despite my attempt at calm. "Hello?" No answer came. Only the echo of my own voice, swallowed almost instantly by the dense air. I walked to another van, its door hanging slightly ajar. The smell hit me first, rotting fabric, metal, and something else I could not identify. My stomach twisted, but I pressed on, peering into the darkness. And there, just at the edge of the beam of light, I saw it again. A shadow, unnaturally long, moving against the contours of the van's interior. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, yet my feet remained rooted. I could not look away. The shadow shifted, elongating, twisting, until it seemed to melt into the walls of the van itself. And then I heard it, a whisper, low, hissing, almost melodic, crawling along the edge of perception. I could not understand the words, but their intent was clear. They were warning me, teasing me, dragging at the corners of my mind. I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight shaking, and tripped over something soft in the grass. It was a jacket, soaked with dew, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar. My pulse raced. Someone had been here recently, or something had been here, and the thought alone made the forest seem to close in around me. I felt eyes in every shadow, 1,000 invisible watchers, and the whispering grew louder, circling, overlapping, impossible to ignore. I ran back to my van, fumbling with the keys as the sound followed me, pressing against my eardrums, a tidal wave of low voices. I could see shapes moving between the abandoned vans, thin, elongated, impossibly fast. The forest was no longer a backdrop. It had become an antagonist, an entity alive with intent. My hands shook as I started the engine, the familiar rumble grounding me just enough to act. As I drove out of the valley, the whispering did not stop. It clung to the edges of my mind, a shadow of sound that refused to be silenced. I dared not look in the rearview mirror, feared that to do so would allow the forest or whatever lived in its depths to reach into my world. Hours later, when the familiar highway stretched ahead, I felt a trembling release, but the memory remained etched into my consciousness. I returned home with a new understanding of fear, one that did not dissipate with distance. It had transformed, quiet and insidious, a reminder that the world contains layers we cannot always see, that some places are alive in ways we cannot understand. I realized that Volkswagen Camping, my escape, my passion, was also a study in vigilance, intuition, and respect. The forest teaches in whispers, in shadows, in moments when the mind is stretched thin and the lessons are never gentle. Rachel eventually returned to her routine, but she too carried the echo of that weekend. We spoke less about the forest and more about the mundane, because language falters in the face of true unknowns. But sometimes in the quiet hours, I feel the pull of the trails again, the undeniable lure of places where whispers follow, and where every turn might reveal a story we are not prepared to hear. Driving the van has become a meditation of sorts. The engine's hum beneath me is a constant reminder of stability in an unstable world. Yet every time I turn onto a forested road I have never traveled, every time the mist curls low and the shadows lengthen, I feel that familiar pressure, the presence of the unseen, the echo of the whispering, the knowledge that the forest watches and remembers. It is this tension, this delicate balance between awe and fear that has reshaped the way I experience the world. Every campsite is no longer just a destination. It is a living puzzle, a test of intuition, courage, and respect. I have learned to trust my instincts, to read the subtle signs in the environment, to listen before acting, to honor the silent warnings before they escalate. And in doing so, I have discovered a deeper understanding of myself, of limits, and of the fragile thread between life and something far older, far more patient than we can comprehend. Sometimes I sit by the van at sunset, windows down, the smell of wet pine drifting in, and I think about those who vanished before us, the locals who warned, the trails that twist beyond reason, the abandoned RVs that seem almost conscious in their decay. There is fear, yes, but also a kind of reverent respect. The forest teaches those who are willing to listen, and the lessons are etched in memory, in muscle, in the subtle rhythm of the wind through the trees. And when I sleep in the van, under the stars, I know that the whispers are still out there, circling, patient. They are a reminder, a teacher, a challenge. To venture into the unknown is to acknowledge that we do not control the world, that we are visitors in spaces older and wiser than ourselves. But it is also to embrace freedom, curiosity, and courage, to recognize that every rattle of a branch, every shadow that stretches just beyond sight, carries the pulse of life and story that cannot be ignored. Volkswagen Camping has always been more than travel. It is immersion, vulnerability, and the chance to confront the edges of reality, where the familiar dissolves and the unknown speaks. And The forest, in its quiet, unnerving, and sometimes terrifying ways, will always be there to teach, to warn, and remind us that the road is never truly empty, and that sometimes the silence is the loudest sound of all. Even now, months later, the memory of that second valley clings to me, sharper than any photograph or journal entry could capture. I've driven thousands of miles since, yet whenever I approach a forested road, I notice the subtle cues, an unnatural silence, a shadow that moves differently than it should, the way the mist clings lower than it ought. The lessons of the abandoned RVs, the whispering, and the forest's patient gaze are not behind me. They travel with me, ingrained in muscle memory and intuition. One weekend, I decided to return to a campground I had never seen before, deep in the Olympic Peninsula. Alone this time, the van felt like a cocoon of protection, yet the engine's hum was no longer purely comforting. It was a rhythm that I matched with my heartbeat, a tether to reality in case the forest decided to test me. The road twisted through evergreens, steep grades, and hairpin turns that demanded attention, and I felt that familiar pull in my chest, that mixture of awe and fear, like the forest itself was breathing just ahead of me. I arrived at the site as dusk approached. There were a few campers scattered, their voices distant, but my instincts tuned to the edges of perception detected anomalies immediately. Fallen logs angled unnaturally, shadows that didn't align with the light, and faintly the soft hissing of a whispering wind, or something that sounded like it. I parked the van, keys still in hand, and took in the scene. The forest was watching. Setting up camp, I noticed the smallest details first. A pile of rocks arranged in a deliberate pattern, footprints in a damp patch of soil that didn't match any known animal, the subtle metallic tang of old iron lingering in the air. I remembered the first clearing, the valley with the abandoned vans, and my skin prickled with recognition. This wasn't mere coincidence. The forest had a pattern, a rhythm, and it was teaching me slowly, insistently. Night fell, and with it came a deep, almost suffocating quiet. The kind that presses into your chest and makes the simple act of breathing feel like intrusion. I sat inside the van, flashlight off, listening. The whispering returned, faint at first, teasing me from the tree line. Not words exactly, but intention. I could feel it, a presence, patient, waiting, testing the boundaries of my courage. I stepped outside, bare feet sinking into the damp earth. The wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic scent again, and I saw movement. Slender, elongated shapes moving between the trees, glimpses of darkness that warped around themselves like smoke. My heart hammered, but I didn't run. I had learned from the first time. Panic would betray me. Observation, attentiveness, respect, that was my only chance. The whispers grew louder, circling, overlapping, echoing in ways that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I realized then that I was not just observing the forest. It was observing me, evaluating whether I belonged here, whether I could navigate its silent trails without faltering. Fear was no longer paralyzing. It had become a tool, sharpening every sense, making me hyper-aware of every nuance. The slight shift of a shadow, the uneven rhythm of the wind, the subtle change in smell that signaled movement. Hours passed. I never stopped listening. At some point, exhaustion threatened to overtake me, but the forest's insistence was relentless. Then, as dawn broke, light poured through the canopy, a mist curling and golden. The shapes, the whispers, they dissolved with the rising sun. The forest relaxed its gaze, and I felt the tension in my body release just enough to breathe normally. I returned to the van, body trembling, mind alert. The lessons I had learned were clear. The forest was alive in ways the human mind struggles to comprehend. Its trails, its clearings, its abandoned RVs were not merely spaces. They were tests, mirrors, reflections of fear and courage intertwined. And though it could terrify, it could also teach. Respect, attentiveness, humility, these were not abstract virtues here. They were survival tools. Driving home, I reflected on every moment. The first clearing, Rachel's trembling hand, the whispers that circled like predatory currents, and the patient shapes that defied description. The fear, the terror, the panic, it had all been real, visceral, and unrelenting. And yet, It had transformed into a different kind of strength, the kind that comes from staring into the unknown and returning changed, aware, alive. Volkswagen Camping is about freedom, about journeying into spaces untamed and untouched. But it is also about listening, truly listening to the subtle language of the land, the forest, the whispers that speak not in words but in instinct, in shadow, in chill. Every mile on these trails is a lesson in humility and courage, a reminder that life's most profound experiences often lie in the balance between fear and awe. Sometimes I close my eyes and remember the mist curling low over the valley, the abandoned vans standing silent, the whispers that brush the edges of comprehension. The memory is no longer just fear. It is a pulse, a rhythm I carry with me. The forest never really lets go. Neither do the lessons it teaches. And in that rhythm, in that tension between what we know and what we cannot, I have found something deeper. The understanding that fear, when faced with awareness and respect, becomes a guide. It tells you where to step lightly, where to pause, where to listen. It reminds you that every journey, even one in an old Volkswagen van along a forgotten forest trail, is not just a passage through space, but a journey into the very fabric of life, mortality, and presence. I no longer seek the abandoned clearings for the thrill of fear. I seek them to learn, to observe, to honor the unspoken laws of the wild. The forest has claimed many before me, and it may claim many after. But I have survived, changed, and returned to share this truth, that the unknown is never empty, and that every road we travel, every trail we follow, carries the echoes of lives that once walked it, of whispers that refuse to be silenced, and of lessons that we must carry, always, with us. Because Volkswagen Camping is more than a road, more than a van, more than freedom. It is a dialogue with the unseen, an apprenticeship with nature itself, and a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward with fear as your companion, listening closely, and honoring every whisper along the way. And so I drive, still the hum of the engine beneath me, the forest ever present at the edges of my vision, and I listen. Always, I listen. I've camped through deserts that felt like the earth had forgotten them, and I've slept in forests so quiet they made me think sound itself had died. But nowhere has ever made me feel as unsafe as Appalachia did. My name's Michael Hayes. I'm 46 years old, born in Southern Ohio, and for the last decade, I've been living full-time out of my RV, a 1996 Fleetwood Bounder that's seen more miles and more nights under strange skies than most people will in a lifetime. I thought I'd learned how to read the land, how to tell when a place didn't want you there. But Appalachia doesn't warn you. It watches. It was early October 2025, the start of what I thought would be another peaceful solo trip through the mountains. The air had that crisp, wet smell of dying leaves, the kind that seeps into your jacket no matter how new it is. I'd left the interstate behind hours earlier, following a narrow county road that wound through West Virginia like it was trying to shake me off. My GPS flickered every few minutes. I didn't think much of it. Mountain interference, I told myself. Everyone loses signal in the ridges. But when the last gas station disappeared behind me and I realized I hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour, something small and sharp started scratching inside my chest. I was headed toward a place called Red Hollow Campground, a name that didn't show up on any of the major camping apps. I'd heard about it from another RVer back in Tennessee, a gray-bearded guy who swore by its isolation. No crowds, no generators, no rangers sticking their nose in your business, he'd said. It's old land, you'll sleep deep there. He'd paused a little too long after saying that. I should have caught it then. But that's the thing about road living. You get used to trusting strangers who look like they've seen the same miles you have. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun had already dipped behind the ridgeline, leaving that heavy copper blue light that tricks your depth perception. The road became gravel, then dirt, then something that wasn't either, slick, soft, and uneven, like tire tracks pressed into old clay. My headlights flashed off dark trees with bark so black it seemed burned. When I finally saw the hand-painted sign, Red Hollow Campers Welcome, it was nailed crookedly to a post that looked like it had once been part of a fence. The letters were smeared, but the arrow pointed down into a hollow so deep it swallowed my beams whole. I should have turned back right then. The descent was worse than I expected. The RV tilted forward, brakes squealing, branches scraping along the roof like claws. When I reached the bottom, the forest opened just enough to reveal a few faded picnic tables and what might have been an old ranger's cabin long ago. Its door hung open, swinging in the wind, the sound hollow and rhythmic. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of leaves that muffled every step. No power hookups, no lights, no sign of life. Still, I parked. There's a kind of pride that gets into people who live out of their rigs. You start thinking you're immune to fear, that as long as you've got 4 walls on wheels and a lock on the door, you're fine. I made a fire, opened a can of chili, and told myself I'd stay one night, just enough to say I'd done it. The silence was total. No crickets, no owls, no distant rush of a creek. Just the occasional drip of condensation sliding from the leaves onto the ground. It felt less like quiet and more like something listening. At around 11 p.m., I heard it for the first time. Not footsteps, more like dragging, something soft moving through the leaf litter just beyond the firelight. I killed my lantern and listened. The sound stopped too. Then, after a long pause, it started again, closer, a shuffling, deliberate sound, circling. I gripped the flashlight beside me and shone it toward the tree line. Nothing. Just a patch of dark so thick it looked like the woods themselves had a pulse. I called out, "Who's there?" That stupid instinct we all have, as if danger would politely introduce itself. Silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere deeper in the trees, came the softest whistle. 3 notes. Slow. Human. I froze. The sound was low and steady, like someone trying to imitate a bird they'd never heard before. I waited. When it didn't repeat, I forced myself back inside the RV, that's locked every latch, and left the lights on. I told myself it was some hunter messing around, maybe a night hiker, but the fear didn't leave. It just settled into me, slow as the cold. Sometime past midnight, to a rhythmic thud against the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was a branch falling, but it came again, measured, intentional. Thud. Pause. Thud. I sat up, the sound vibrating through the metal frame like a heartbeat. I shouted, but the noise stopped instantly. The silence afterward was so complete that my ears rang. I waited, staring at the window. Then I saw it. A handprint, clear as day, pressed against the glass, smudged mud, long fingers, not small, human size, but crooked, as if the joints didn't bend right. I grabbed my phone to snap a picture, but the screen glowed blank. Battery dead. I know it was at 70% before I fell asleep. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, I stepped outside. The ground was disturbed around my RV, drag marks leading from the edge of the woods to where I stood. They didn't look like footprints, more like something crawling low. My fire pit had been scattered, my cooler tipped, but the strangest thing? The handprint on the window. It was gone, not wiped away. Gone, like the glass had never been touched. I left that morning. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that maybe it was a bear, maybe the condensation made shapes I imagined into fingers. But the deeper I drove up the mountain roads, the worse it felt. I stopped in a small diner around noon, a one-room place with fogged windows and the smell of bacon and pine cleaner. The waitress looked like she'd seen too many winters. When I told her where I'd camped, she dropped the pot of coffee she was holding. "Red Hollow?" she whispered. "You shouldn't have gone there." She said it used to be a company town back in the 1930s, built around a mine that collapsed one night with all the workers inside. The families waited for days, but no bodies were ever recovered. The tunnels just sank. People said you could still hear knocking under the ground when the fog got thick enough, like they were still digging to get out. The forest reclaimed the place after that. Only hunters and the occasional drifter went near it. She leaned in close. They say the ones who stayed too long started hearing their own names in the whistling. I didn't touch my food. I left a few bills on the table and walked out into the misty daylight. That's when I realized the smell. The same wet mineral scent I'd noticed in the hollow. It clung to me. My jacket, my hands, my hair. Like old earth and rusted metal. I scrubbed at it in the restroom sink of a gas station 30 miles away, but it didn't fade. And that night, when I parked at a proper RV park with other rigs around me, I swore I heard that same 3-note whistle drift across the lot, carried on a wind that shouldn't have been there. That was when I stopped sleeping near forests for a while. But Appalachia, it follows you. You think you leave it behind when you cross the state line, but it stays in your thoughts in the quiet moments before sleep. That's when you realize that maybe the land doesn't forget who's been down in its hollows. I left West Virginia the next morning, driving north along the Blue Ridge Parkway, trying to shake off the feeling that something had come with me. I kept telling myself that fear is just residue, that when you spend a night in a place like Red Hollow, the mind holds on to it like smoke in a jacket. You can drive 1,000 miles, but that smell of dread still lingers somewhere inside you. By the time I crossed into Virginia, the road opened into wide, misted overlooks. The light was strange that day. White, diffused, like the sky couldn't decide whether it was morning or evening. I'd been driving since dawn, chasing that sense of normalcy, the hum of tires and radio static soothing me like a heartbeat. Every so often I'd check my mirrors, not because I expected to see anyone, but because I needed to know I was still alone. Somewhere past the town of Buchanan, I stopped at a scenic pullout where an old RV sat half sunk into the mud. The tires cracked and the windows fogged from the inside. There was a faint imprint of a hand against the glass, not muddy like before, but inside out as if someone had pressed from within. I told myself it was condensation. I told myself a lot of things. But I didn't linger. I found another campsite by dusk, a state-maintained one with hookups, ranger patrols, and half a dozen other campers. The kind of place where you think fear can't reach you because civilization is within shouting distance. I set up beside a couple from North Carolina who were grilling by their fifth wheel. They were kind, talkative, and oblivious to the storm I was carrying around inside. I told them I'd come from Red Hollow, half expecting them to laugh it off. They didn't. The man, Jim, stopped mid-bite, his face tightening. "You camped there, alone?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Didn't stay long." He shook his head slowly. "My brother-in-law disappeared there 2 years ago. Park ranger found his RV, still running. Door wide open. No footprints leading away." His wife looked at him sharply, like he shouldn't have said that. Then she added, almost to herself, "They say that place takes what it's owed. The mountain don't like to be disturbed." I didn't sleep much that night either. Every time the wind moved through the trees, it sounded like a whisper you almost recognized. Around 2 a.m., the park lights flickered just once. And then, I swear this, from somewhere down the road came those same 3 notes. Slow. Uneven. Like something learning how to whistle. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. The campground was still, bathed in that soft artificial orange glow that makes everything look smaller, safer. But the air had that wet metal smell again, the one from the hollow. I walked to the edge of the woods. Nothing moved. The trees loomed tall, bark slick with dew. I was about to turn back when I noticed the ground, tiny streaks of mud dragging from the forest line toward the RV row. Not footprints, slides. When morning came, I convinced myself it was runoff from the rain that had passed through overnight. But deep down, I knew. I packed up before sunrise and left without saying goodbye. For the next week, I kept moving. Through the Shenandoah, through Pennsylvania, past those endless waves of green mountains that never stop rolling toward the horizon. Appalachia isn't just a range. It's a living spine, old and stubborn. You can feel it breathing under the asphalt. I stopped at a small RV park outside Scranton one evening, and when I registered at the front office, the manager looked at my plates, then at the layer of reddish mud still stuck to the wheels. "Been south, huh?" he said, nodding toward the clay. "That looks like West Virginia dirt." I laughed nervously. "Yeah, been a while on the back roads." He didn't smile. "You ever clean that off, son? The ground keeps what's been buried in it." That night, I dreamed of the handprint again. Except this time it wasn't outside the window. It was on the inside, sliding down the glass while I watched, unable to move. When I woke up, there were streaks of moisture across the inside of the window, shaped like fingers. It's hard to explain what that kind of fear does to you. It doesn't make you scream or panic. It makes you quiet. It makes you start noticing things you wish you didn't. Like how every RV park, no matter how new, has that one lot no one parks in. Or how sometimes when you wake up just before dawn, you can hear a soft, steady knocking, not loud enough to be real, not quiet enough to ignore. 2 nights later, I met an older man, Leonard, at a rest stop in upstate New York. He was sitting by a fire in a beat-up Airstream, drinking black coffee like it was medicine. He saw the mud on my tires, too. "You been in the hollow?" he asked. "Not a hollow. The hollow." I nodded, too tired to pretend anymore. He leaned forward, his voice a rasp. "They're not ghosts, you know. The ones down there, they're the land remembering what people did to it. You can't bury that deep enough. Every time someone camps there, it remembers." He said he used to be a surveyor back in the 80s. They tried to reopen part of the mine, thinking the old tunnels might still hold coal. The night before the first dig, his crew heard knocking under the soil. "Like hammer on metal," he said. Then the ground just gave way. "We lost 2 men before sunrise. I quit that day." I asked if anyone ever went back. He shook his head. "No point. You can't fix land that wants to stay broken." When I drove away, I kept glancing in the side mirror. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, just a ripple in the reflection, like someone pacing behind the RV, always staying just out of view. By the time I reached Maine, I told myself I was done with the mountains for good. I parked by the coast, listened to the sea for the first time in weeks. I thought maybe the wind would clear it all out of me. But that night, when the tide came in, the waves carried that same pattern. 3 rises, 3 falls, like breathing, like whistling through water. That's when I realized the truth. You don't have to stay in Appalachia for it to follow you. If you've heard it once, the drag through the leaves, the knock beneath the ground, the voice that almost sounds like your own, then part of you is already buried there. I used to think RV life meant freedom, that I could drive away from anything, my mistakes, my fears, even the past. But the land teaches you something different. Out here, you don't really escape. You just move between places that remember more than you do. And Appalachia remembers everything. I tell this story not to scare you, but to remind you. Some places aren't meant for camping. Some land doesn't want to be slept on. So if you ever find yourself driving through the misty roads of West Virginia or the deep hollows of Kentucky and you see a hand-painted sign that says, "Campers Welcome," do yourself a favor. Keep driving, because once the mountains start watching you, they don't stop. I never thought the smell of pine needles could make my chest tighten the way it did that evening. It was early September, and the fading sun cast long, fractured shadows across Silent Hills Campground. The place had been quiet for weeks. Empty RVs lined the gravel roads like abandoned sentinels, their paint peeling, windows dusty, stories trapped inside. My Volkswagen van, a beat-up '87 Westphalia I'd patched together with love and stubbornness, hissed to a stop on the cracked asphalt. I was chasing the kind of solitude that most people only imagine in books or Instagram posts, the kind that promises peace but can quickly turn into something else entirely. I should have felt excitement, but a low hum of unease settled in my stomach as I stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and old leaves, sharp and pungent, almost metallic. I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was here. The stories about Silent Hills had circulated for months online. Campers vanishing without a trace, strange footprints appearing around their campsites, whispered voices at night. but I was confident in my preparedness. I had maps, a fully stocked van, and a solid plan. I thought fear was something you could manage with preparation. That was my first mistake. I parked near one of the older loops where a few decrepit RVs sat at odd angles, doors slightly ajar as if their owners had left in a hurry. The name on a faded sticker read, Tommy and Claire, 2018. I paused, staring at the van for a moment, imagining the story it could tell if it could speak. My own van suddenly felt small, fragile, like a paper boat on a darkening river. I told myself it was just the wind rattling the metal siding. I told myself that, but the sound didn't belong to the wind. By the time I set up camp, shadows were pooling between the trees. I lit a small lantern, the orange glow trembling on the bark. I tried to focus on the mundane, unpacking the cooler, setting up the foldable chairs, but the forest seemed to breathe around me. There was a rhythm to it, soft and almost imperceptible, a creak, a snap, the distant cough of some unseen creature. Every noise felt amplified. My own heart beat louder than it should have, hammering like a warning drum. I wanted to tell myself that paranoia was part of solo camping, part of the thrill. But when I walked the loop to stretch my legs, the emptiness of the place began to press in. Each RV had its own story, frozen in dust and rust. One had a child's drawing taped to the window, curled and yellowed. Another had a pair of boots sitting perfectly together outside the door. No people, just traces, like echoes of lives paused mid-step. That night, I lay in my van, cocooned in the dim warmth of the sleeping bag, trying to silence the unease. I could hear the soft hum of crickets, a distant owl, and something else, low, deliberate footsteps on gravel. I froze, listening. They circled my sight slowly, almost rhythmically, never quick enough to startle but enough to unsettle. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, a fox. Rational thought felt fragile, flimsy against the weight of what I was hearing. Sleep came in fits and starts, punctuated by the occasional metallic clink, a door gently swaying in the wind. Or so I hoped. When morning arrived, the forest looked entirely different. Shadows from the night had disappeared, replaced by soft gold and the smell of damp moss. I tried to convince myself that the fear had been imaginary. Yet as I sipped coffee, I noticed it. Footprints leading away from my van toward the thickest part of the woods. Not animal prints. Too deliberate, too human. And they didn't match my own. I debated whether to follow them. The rational part of me screamed to leave, to drive out before curiosity dug a deeper hole in my mind. But there was also something else, an almost magnetic pull, the desire to understand, to uncover what had happened here before me. So I followed. The forest thickened quickly. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, and the air grew cooler, almost damp with a smell I couldn't place, like wet moss mixed with iron. The footsteps led to an old campsite, a circle of stones blackened by fires long extinguished. The space felt intentionally abandoned, yet there was a freshness to it, as if someone had been there recently. My pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, yet my feet moved forward, drawn by curiosity and an inexplicable need for answers. Then I saw it, a small, carved symbol on a tree trunk. Nothing elaborate, just a simple, sharp X, but the edges were clean, precise, as if made yesterday. A shiver ran through me. The forest around me seemed to contract, branches brushing against my shoulders like fingers. I realized that for weeks, for months, maybe even years, people had come here seeking solitude, only to disappear. And the footprints, the symbol, they were the only breadcrumbs left behind. I turned to go back, but the path was gone. Thick ferns and brambles blocked the way I had walked in, as though the forest itself was shifting, mocking me. My heart pounded, and the fear that had been a whisper now roared inside me. I began calling out, my voice swallowed by the trees, echoing back in distorted, unfamiliar tones. There was no response, only the quiet, heavy breathing of the woods and the occasional rustle that sounded like footsteps but never revealed a source. Panic set in, slow and suffocating. I tried to calm myself, telling myself to retrace my steps to focus on the markers I had left. But everything looked different. The landmarks subtly shifted. My van's safety, my well-stocked supplies, my plan, they felt like illusions, fragile shields against something far older and more patient than me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had a strange quality here, stretching and contracting. Shadows deepened without the sun moving. I kept moving, following instinct rather than reason, until I came to a clearing. In the center, an empty RV stood, headlights faintly reflecting the waning sunlight, its door slightly ajar. It wasn't one I had seen before. It was newer, cleaner, too normal for the desolation around me. I approached cautiously. Inside, nothing. Just a faint smell of metal and coffee, as though someone had been here but left in a hurry. The forest seemed to lean closer, watching, and then I heard it, a whisper. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but unmistakable. "Don't leave." My breath caught. I spun around. Nothing, just the forest. But the voice lingered in my mind, cold and precise, and it wasn't alone. Behind me, the brambles shifted. Something moved within them, just out of sight, deliberate and silent. I understood in that instant that fear wasn't just a feeling here, it was a living, breathing entity, wrapping itself around me, feeding on my hesitation. I ran. Not in a panicked frenzy, but deliberate, precise steps, weaving through the trees, following the only instinct I had left, survival. My van appeared suddenly through the trees, like a beacon. I flung open the door, threw myself inside, and started the engine, hands trembling so violently that the gears jerked. I drove without thought, only the rising sun to guide me back to roads that felt solid, safe. By the time I reached the main highway, the forest was behind me. Silent Hills disappeared into the distance, a shadowed memory in the rearview mirror. My body ached, but the most profound ache was in my chest, the realization that the forest, the empty RVs, the vanished campers, they were warnings I had only just begun to understand. And yet, even as I drove, my mind returned to that whisper and to the small symbol carved into the tree. It was a reminder. Fear isn't a monster you defeat. It's a teacher, persistent, patient, and necessary. I had survived, yes, but survival meant acknowledging that some places in America's wild heart are not just empty. They are alive with memory, with history, with consequences for those who enter without respect or caution. Silent Hills taught me that solitude is a double-edged sword. The same calm that draws you in can also hide a presence that watches, measures, waits. I left with more than a story. I left with an understanding that the road is as much a test of intuition as of skill. And every time I glance at my Volkswagen van, patched and worn, I remember that night. The whispers, the footprints, the sense that the forest itself had judged me and in some quiet, essential way allowed me to leave. Even after I'd left Silent Hills behind, the unease didn't fade. It clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake, growing in the quiet moments of the road. The highway stretched endlessly, my van humming beneath me. But the scenery, rolling hills, dense forests, and scattered towns, felt subtly wrong, as though the edges of reality had softened. Every bend, every dip in the asphalt seemed to carry a memory of the campsite, the whispered warning of something that had watched me and then, inexplicably, let me go. I stopped at a small diner in a town called Millstone, a place I had passed many times before, but never lingered. The neon sign flickered in the early afternoon light, and inside, the air smelled of fried eggs and stale coffee. I thought maybe a mundane environment would anchor me back to the normal world. I was wrong. Sitting in the corner booth, I noticed a man staring at me. He was older, with silver hair and a jacket that had clearly seen better days. There was something in his eyes, recognition, or perhaps warning. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just watched. When our eyes met, a shiver ran down my spine. He had the faintest scar above his brow, subtle but oddly familiar. And then I realized why his gaze unsettled me. It carried the same weight, the same quiet authority as the forest at Silent Hills. I finished my coffee quickly, paid, and left, the man's eyes following me as I stepped into the cool afternoon. My van felt both like a refuge and a cage. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it all, that the footprints, the whisper, and the empty RVs were part of some collective anxiety shared by those who ventured into isolated campgrounds. But the nagging unease persisted, amplified by every unexpected sound: a scraping branch against the side of the van, a bird's cry too close to the edge of hearing, the echo of footsteps on asphalt that weren't mine. I needed to understand, not for thrill, not for curiosity alone, but to confront the fear that had latched onto me. I decided to return, to map the areas, to uncover what had happened to the campers who disappeared. It was reckless, I knew that. But fear, I had learned, wasn't something that went away by driving for miles. It needed acknowledgement. 2 weeks later, I returned with a different plan. I wasn't going alone this time. My friend Elise, a wildlife biologist with an encyclopedic knowledge of forest behavior, agreed to come along. Elise was rational, methodical, and skeptical, qualities I needed to balance my own tendencies toward intuition and impulse. She laughed at my tales of whispers and footprints at first, her humor a balm for my nerves, but agreed that the deserted loops and abandoned RVs were worth investigating from a research perspective. The drive back to Silent Hills was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the spaces between our thoughts. As we turned onto the access road, the familiar hollow feeling returned. The forest seemed to tense, welcoming or perhaps warning us. I parked near the same loop as before. The old RVs greeted us like patient ghosts. Dust motes floated in the shafts of late afternoon sun, giving the impression that time had frozen in these small spaces. We set up camp, our movements deliberate. Elise unpacked equipment for documenting the area: cameras, GPS trackers, notebooks. I tried to focus on the practical, but the subtle reminders of my previous visit pressed in. The way shadows clung to corners, the slight sway of an empty door in the wind, the distant crunch of gravel that didn't belong to either of us. Night came faster than expected. We ate a quiet dinner, sharing small talk, but the forest intruded on every comfortable pause. At first, it was small things: a rustle, a twig snapping, a low wind that sounded almost like a sigh. Then it escalated. Our campfire flickered erratically, and the lanterns cast long, jittering shadows that made every tree look like a crouching figure. I tried to rationalize it. My mind wanted a logical explanation, but part of me already knew there was none. Then Elise noticed it: a movement in the edge of the trees, subtle but deliberate, a shadow that didn't behave naturally. She whispered, pointing toward a narrow clearing between the pines. I squinted, trying to make sense of the motion. And then I saw it. A figure. Human-shaped, motionless at first, then shifting slowly as though observing us without stepping fully into the open. The tension tightened like a cord around my chest. I remembered the whisper from my first visit: "Don't leave." But now, with Elise beside me, the words felt less like a warning and more like an invitation to confront, to survive, to see the forest for what it truly was. We decided to investigate the clearing at first light. I slept poorly, listening to the forest breathe, my body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. Elise barely slept at all, meticulous in her note-taking and equipment checks. By dawn, the forest had an eerie serenity, soft light filtering through the canopy and painting the ground in dappled gold. But serenity was deceptive here. We followed a faint path toward the clearing. Footprints, fresh and unmistakably human, marked the soil. They led to another abandoned RV, cleaner than the ones in the loops, its side window cracked open. Inside, we found signs of recent habitation: food wrappers, a journal half buried under a sleeping bag, and an old map with several locations circled. Elise inspected everything with scientific precision while I stared at the journal, reading fragments of someone's life before it vanished into the forest. Names, dates, simple entries that ended abruptly. Saw them again today. Too many shadows. Can't leave. The realization hit us both. The campers hadn't just disappeared. They had been watched, tracked, studied, perhaps even hunted. Not by humans, but by the forest itself, or something it harbored. Fear had become tangible, almost sentient, shaping the actions of those who entered too deeply. We continued cautiously, moving from RV to RV, noting symbols carved into trees, footprints, and subtle markers that had likely guided previous visitors. Every sound, every movement in the brush carried weight. I realized my first instinct, the one that had almost kept me from returning, was correct. The forest was a living entity, attuned to those who entered, measuring resolve, fear, and intent. By nightfall, we reached the oldest section of Silent Hills. Here, the forest felt older, denser, almost oppressive. Abandoned RVs were stacked closer together, windows blackened with age, doors ajar. The air smelled richer, heavier, almost iron-like. Shadows pooled unnaturally, forming shapes that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then we heard it. Soft whispers again, faint but unmistakable. "Why are you here?" The voice seemed to ask, not cruelly but with intent. It was layered, as if multiple presences spoke at once. I froze. Elise grabbed my arm, her eyes wide, voice low. "We need to leave," she said, but neither of us moved. The curiosity, the drive to understand, held us rooted in place even as fear surged. A low, deliberate step echoed from behind us. Something or someone was approaching. We held our breath. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. Human? Not quite. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, gliding more than walking. It paused, observing us, the forest holding its breath along with us. We didn't run. We didn't speak. We just watched, hearts hammering, minds racing, understanding that some truths in Silent Hills were meant to be glimpsed, not fully grasped. After what felt like hours, but was likely seconds, it vanished, slipping between the trees with impossible silence. The forest exhaled, releasing us, but the lesson was clear. Intrusion here had consequences, and observation alone could be as perilous as ignorance. We returned to our van, shaken but alive. Silent Hills had taught us something fundamental, not just about fear, but about respect, vigilance, and the fragility of human perception. Every camper who vanished had underestimated the forest's quiet intelligence, its capacity to observe and respond. We had survived because we approached with care, curiosity tempered by caution. The next morning, as we packed to leave, I glanced back at the loops, at the empty RVs and the shadows pooling between them. They were silent, still, but I knew better. The forest had memory. It had noticed us. And though we drove away, I understood that our visit had changed us in subtle but profound ways. Fear had taught me resilience. Silence had taught me attention. And the forest, in its eerie, deliberate patience, had reminded me that some adventures are meant not for conquering, but for learning. Even now, months later, I can feel Silent Hills in the quiet moments, when the wind rustles the trees along a country road, or when the hum of my van engine matches the heartbeat of a lonely forest. It lingers, a whisper of caution, a call to awareness. And every time I take the wheel, I carry that lesson with me, that the wild is not empty. It is full of eyes, of echoes, and of the unseen watchers who remind you always that survival is not just about strength or skill, but about respect, understanding, and the willingness to listen to the quiet warnings that most people ignore. The days after Silent Hills blurred together, the memory of that forest lingering like a shadow behind my eyes. Even the hum of my van felt different, as if the engine had absorbed some residue of that quiet menace. I tried to convince myself that returning to routine would erase the fear, but it didn't. Fear, I realized, isn't something that fades with distance. It evolves. It becomes part of your consciousness, reshaping the way you move, perceive, and remember. I kept traveling, visiting campgrounds farther and farther from Silent Hills, each one less sinister, but the forest had changed the lens through which I saw the world. I noticed the subtle signs others overlooked, the way shadows lingered longer than they should, the way an abandoned RV could feel like a heartbeat waiting in the dark, the whisper of wind that sometimes carried a syllable meant just for you. And in these observations, I found a strange kind of clarity. Fear, I realized, could sharpen the senses, teaching patience, awareness, and respect for spaces that weren't ours. One evening, months later, I found myself on a winding road through northern Montana, the sun sinking behind jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the valleys. I parked my van near a small lake, the surface perfectly still, mirroring the sky. The air smelled like wet pine, fresh and clean, but I couldn't shake the memory of Silent Hills, the rustle of the brambles, the carved symbols, the whispers. I had come alone this time, not for thrill, not for research, but for reflection. My fingers traced the scratches in the dashboard, worn smooth by countless trips, countless hours behind the wheel, and countless lessons learned from the wilderness. The van, patched and battered, felt like a living companion. Together, it had carried me through fear, through uncertainty, and back into a world that was both beautiful and perilous. As night fell, I set up camp by the lake, the water catching the last light of the day, shimmering like molten silver. The forest surrounding me was alive with sound, the distant call of a loon, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But unlike Silent Hills, the noises didn't carry menace. They carried life. I realized that the forest wasn't malevolent everywhere. It had rules, boundaries, and consequences, but it also had rhythm, patterns, and quiet wisdom. It demanded respect, and it rewarded those who approached with care. I lit a small fire, watching the flames dance, listening to the crackle as they consumed the dry wood. Memories of Silent Hills surfaced again. The footprints, the whispers, the empty RVs, but this time they felt less like threats and more like teachers. Each vanished camper, each unexplainable sound, each carved symbol had been a lesson. The forest had offered a mirror, showing fear not as weakness, but as insight. I felt gratitude, strange and heavy, for the lessons that had nearly broken me. Sleep that night was deeper, though I still listened with awareness. Every snap of a twig or splash in the lake registered as information rather than panic. I understood now that fear wasn't meant to paralyze, it was meant to guide, to sharpen instincts, to cultivate humility in the face of forces far older and wiser than we are. My van, parked nearby, felt like an anchor to the human world, a reminder that preparation, experience, and mindfulness were all tools to navigate the unknown. When morning came, the lake reflected the rising sun in brilliant golds and reds, the world momentarily suspended in beauty. I took a long walk along the shore, feeling the wet sand beneath my boots, the air crisp against my skin. I noticed tracks, deer, perhaps a fox, but no footprints that weren't ours. The forest here respected us because we respected it. I realized that Silent Hills had been the ultimate test: patience, observation, and humility against fear itself. And I had passed, not by brute force or bravado, but by learning, listening, and surviving with awareness. Driving away, I thought about the campers who had vanished, their stories left in the quiet of abandoned RVs, their names etched in memory and legend. I thought about the whispers, the symbols, the feeling of being watched. And I thought about the lessons embedded in fear, that it sharpens the senses, that it demands respect, that it teaches patience, resilience, and the importance of intuition. The world is vast, wild, and sometimes terrifying, but it is also alive, responsive, and profoundly instructive. As the miles passed, I reflected on the van itself, my steadfast companion through these trials. The hum of the engine had become a rhythm, a heartbeat, carrying me through forests, mountains, and lonely highways. It had taken me to places that challenged every assumption I had about safety, fear, and courage. And yet, it had also carried me back, intact, changed, wiser. I realized that the vehicle wasn't just a van. It was a vessel for transformation, a space where fear could be confronted and lessons absorbed, where vulnerability became clarity. By the time I reached the edge of civilization again, towns with streetlights, the distant glow of diners, the familiarity of human patterns, I felt a profound gratitude for both the terror and the beauty of the wild. Fear had been my teacher, the forest my guide, and the van my safe passage. Each camper who disappeared, each empty RV I had encountered, each whisper in the night had been part of a larger story, one that spoke of respect, observation, and the courage to face the unknown. Even now, I carry Silent Hills with me, in every journey, every campsite, every forest path. It has taught me to move deliberately, to observe carefully, and to trust my instincts. It has shown me that fear is not a weakness, but a signal, a compass pointing toward awareness and wisdom. And most importantly, it has taught me that survival isn't just about escaping danger, it's about understanding it, respecting it, and letting it shape you into someone capable of facing life's wild, unpredictable challenges. As I park my van at another remote camp, watching the sun slip behind the trees, I feel the same low hum of anticipation, the same thrill of solitude tempered by caution. I know the forest is watching, and I respect that. I set up my small fire, the light flickering against the darkness, and I smile quietly to myself. Fear has taught me resilience. Silence has taught me attentiveness, and the wild in all its vast, unknowable beauty has taught me humility. I sit there in the quiet, listening to the night breathe, feeling the wind in the trees, and I realize that every van trip, every solo journey, every encounter with the unknown is not just a story. It is a lesson, a reminder, and a chance to grow. The forests of America, from the high peaks of Montana to the shadowed loops of Silent Hills, are alive with whispers, shadows, and memories. They are dangerous, yes, but they are also teachers. And when I finally close my eyes, cocooned in the van I have come to trust more than almost anything else, I understand this. The fear I faced was not my enemy. It was a mirror, a guide, a catalyst for growth. Silent Hills did not just scare me, it transformed me, revealing the depth of courage, awareness, and respect necessary to navigate the unknown. And as I drift into sleep, the forest outside alive with unseen life, I feel a quiet certainty. I have been changed, but I have survived, and the lessons I carry are eternal. The journey continues, but the truth is clear. Every empty RV, every whispering forest, every shadowed path is an invitation to listen, to learn, and to emerge stronger. Silent Hills is not just a place, it is a teacher, and its lessons remain with those willing to observe, willing to respect, and willing to face fear with clarity and courage.